So up next, we have Shift Left, Shift Right, the DevOps Hokey Pokey. I'm in love with the title alone, so I'm really excited to bring on our speakers, and I'll let you guys introduce and take it away.
Sure. So, yeah, I appreciate it. So, yeah, like you said, thanks, Jeff. Shift Left, Shift Right, the DevSecOps Hokey Pokey. We are going to talk today all about how we employ strategies to bring security into this DevOps picture. DevOps has been around since 2008. We've pretty well know what that animal looks like at this point, but we still struggle to make security a part of it. So first and foremost, a couple introductions. My name's Alyssa Miller. I'm an application security advocate for Snyk. I am a recovering developer I spent 10 years in financial services as a dev before I moved into security, where I've been for the last almost 15 years of my life. So I have the fortunate position of having seen both sides of this, well, at least two of the three sides of the equation. And quite honestly, I've seen the ops side too. But I've got someone really cool here with me as well.
Hey there, folks. My name is Garrett Gross. I work as a technical advisor doing application security at Rapid7. My background is your typical script kiddie, starting from a young age, and somehow honed that into a trade. So happy to be here, and love speaking with Alyssa. This is our third time speaking together?
Fourth. Yeah, we did a couple events at RSA earlier this year, and who knew those were going to be the better times?
Right. Back in the old days. Right. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. The long ago.
Right.
It has definitely changed a lot. But, it's not just our world as we know it now that's changed a lot. Software development has really changed a lot. And our attitudes towards software development have changed quite a bit too. When we talk about security, years and years ago, we would have conversations about security, and the message always was kind of, the security team was responsible for that. The security team, they handle it. All right. We've grown with this message for years now. We've pushed out there this idea of, okay, security's got to push left. We need to get further into the SDLC. And then DevOps showed up about, a little over a decade ago. And then it was like, oh my gosh, these developers are moving faster and faster. How are we going to keep up with security? And so we've put more and more pressure on developers. And indeed, we see that in the attitudes across the industry. Snyk last year in our annual State of Open Source Security report, we asked a question on our survey: who should own application security in your organization? As you can see the results, overwhelmingly, they picked developers. So this wasn't a pick one. This was a multi-select, as you can see from the percentages here. And yet developers stood out far and away more than security or operations or anyone else. Garrett, I assume you've heard this before too.
Yeah, I mean, this is consistent with what we hear all the time. I think every time you and I ask this question, it's about this same split. And, my experience was we only had so much influence. You started to see how much multifaceted buy-in you needed from other parts of the business, not only just the technical stakeholders. So we see this trend shifting now to where developers are thought to own security, but we're starting to see that it's kind of shared amongst the organizations.
So that's not the only thing that's changed about development. I think back to when I was a developer, right? And if I wrote an application, I had an application that was 100,000 lines of code. I pretty much wrote 100,000 lines of code. Yeah, maybe I pulled in other redistributables and things that were in, whether they're in DLLs or other libraries or things, however, depending on where we were programming at the time. But that's all changed now, and it's really become exacerbated by this DevOps approach. And really, that's led to this growth in open source packages. So I can take an application like this example Java application, 3 Java files, 80 lines of code this developer wrote. But they included 7 other packages. You can see the Spring Boot framework here and being included. And what happens is now those 7 dependencies that I have in my application, well, they've all got their own dependencies too. So that turns into 59 additional dependencies that I may or may not even know about, but that's 713,000 lines of code. My 80 lines turned into 713,000. That's almost a 1,000% increase in application size. And the worst part is I might not even know all of what's there.
Well, and you could say, well, okay, why don't you just dig into it? Why don't you just check out what that code base looks like of all these dependencies? But you got to remember the nature of DevOps, the speed at which we now operate prevents that. It would be absolutely impossible, and your business would not support that level of manual introspection, I guess you could call it that.
Yeah, I mean, if for anybody that's ever, see, this is where if we were live, I'd be asking you who's ever tried to like manually walk a dependency tree. It's nightmarish. And so that can be something that's truly difficult. But it's not just developers who have a problem. It's the ops side. So here, this is a great tweet from Kelsey Hightower. I was debating how I was going to quote it. And ultimately, we just decided, you know what? We'll just take Kelsey's tweet directly. You know, this is the reality. When you want to spin up an application environment, you're going to roll that new infrastructure. This is everything that's involved, but yet we're expecting the developers more and more as we move into this, you know, containers and cloud native environments, all these new paradigms. We're expecting developers to be able to write code that defines all of these components to the infrastructure that their software is going to run in. And so now we're saying, okay, devs, you're responsible for developing code. You're responsible for making sure it's secure. And oh, by the way, it's up to you devs to take care of this whole ops side of it as well, because, hey, we're doing a DevOps culture here. We, you know, dev and ops, you're all together. So you all work this together. And this is just adding further complexity.
Yeah, and on the security side, you almost have to be an expert in how each of these interoperate and who's sharing which permissions. And, you know, Kelsey's talking about you need, you know, the rest of that as well, bring servers, people, and glue. Well, I mean, I don't know what you think, Alyssa, but that glue to me is communication and kind of like a shared buy-in. And that's quite the evolution in that relationship. I mean, yeah. We're seeing it today and we're seeing folks that are really executing and firing on all cylinders. But for those folks that are in that, you know, transition to a DevOps or, you know, in the security auspices, a CI/CD type integration, it's tough and it's not the easiest path.
Yeah. So you mentioned security, right? I mean, oh my God, talk about complexity. We're adding more and more technology every day that security is now gotta be aware of. We're adding all of these things in terms of compliance factors and audits and all these layers of security that we're looking for. So now add this on top. And this is what we're talking about now when we say DevSecOps. We're looking for people who run a shared responsibility across all these areas. And indeed, I mean, you know, you've got 2 security people here sitting in a DevOps track, which should tell you something right away that, all right, there's more work to be done here.
Well, and I mean, again, that relationship kind of getting this going not only relies on mastery and just an awareness of all these technologies, but also relies on your ability to execute in a time frame that, you know, you've already committed to. And like Alyssa said, I'm not a developer. I've never been a developer. I have the utmost respect for dev teams. But that motivation of getting stuff out quickly is much different from my motivation, which is I'm culpable for the security of this product. So timing, you know, and speed and stuff, it's kind of a meeting in the middle and trying to understand each side and each other's motivations is also kind of what comes into play here.
Yeah. And so you have kind of that, what we've always felt in these silos is those conflicting priorities, right? So if we look at the reality of what's happening in DevSecOps today, we've got developers trying to push right because we're telling them, hey, you've got more and more of the infrastructure. You're writing code that's defining the very infrastructure on which your stuff's going to run, whether it's in a cloud, whether you're using some other container environment, whatever it is. As a result of that, we've got ops pushing up the stack because more and more of this is now code defined. Less and less of the infrastructure is actually physical hardware that we're worrying about. And then you've got security, who have for the last 2 decades at least has been trying to push left. And so the thing I really liked in Kelsey's tweet, I think we're going to referencing back to that a few times, is, he mentions people. So often when we talk DevSecOps, we get hung up in technology. And maybe we think about process, right? We think about a DevOps pipeline, we think about CI/CD, and we think about how are we going to automate that and make it faster. All too often, we forget that DevOps and therefore DevSecOps is really all about the culture. That's right. So how do we bring these people together?
Yeah, there's only so much that pizza and drinks can do to heal that relationship that, it just traditionally has been tenuous. I know that what I've experienced in the past is something gets pushed out, it's pushed out to production. You run some sort of external scan, pen test or a DAS scan or something like that. And then you communicate those results back in this somewhat voluminous format, and just adds a bunch of work. And, oftentimes the dev teams spend a lot of times poking holes in the tools and kind of proving why they don't work that well, as rather than chewing through the results and kind of abiding by your remediation guidance.
And it's that feedback loop, right? That slow feedback loop that makes this traditional approach that you see here not work anymore.
Yep.
This is why security is struggling so hard with DevOps still over a decade later. It's because we've always thought of security as we're the gatekeepers. We have these gates between the various phases of that delivery pipeline, and there's this big feedback loop. And like you said, we create these huge reports of here's all your vulnerabilities, you got to fix them. We don't enable developers to address that as part of their processes. And what we need to do is we need to give them the knowledge and the ability to make decisions so that they can do this as a part of those phases of their development. So rather than having these gates between phases, how do we make security practices a part of that phase? How does threat modeling become part of the backlog? How does SAST and DAST tools become part of our build and test processes? How does container security fit in with our deployment process and so forth?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that relationship, proving that you're there to augment it in a positive way rather than hinder it is key. And, what better way than to actually put this functionality in the hands of your development teams rather than abstracting and, kind of making them play by your rules, offer that same functionality and that same reach and visibility through the IDE or deploy an automation framework like Jenkins. It goes a very long way. And again, it kind of in tandem builds a little bit of responsibility in the development team of security.
Yep. And that's that concept of frictionless enablement. This is what makes DevSecOps work. When I can enable my developers with security practices that bring them the tools and the decision-making power that they need to be able to do this in a way that is frictionless to their existing development processes. This is kind of the holy grail of DevSecOps. So how do we chase this down? Well, we need to start by just reducing the noise and fatigue. We talked about these large reports and how getting that at the end of a development cycle when we're ready to go deploy, if we're in a CI/CD pipeline in particular, we can't afford those long feedback loops. So how can we start reducing that? Well, I mentioned threat modeling. How do we bring threat modeling into the backlog? Well, make it part of the user story. Why doesn't the user story capture the threat model for that particular user story? Think about it this way. If you've got business people, you've got business analysts or whoever it is that's writing your user stories, why aren't they the most capable actually of being able to put context around what the threats are that user story introduces to the application. Now, with that information as part of the user story, when I pull that user story into my sprint, I know that, okay, I can prioritize how I'm going to design, as I'm coding this, I can start to prioritize based on the risks that have been identified through that threat model. And now as I'm designing for code, I know what the requirements are, the security controls that I need to address that are going to ultimately mitigate those threats to that user story that I'm now working to implement within my application. And of course, this continues flowing up the line, then through the pipeline. It hits CI/CD. If I've got that information from the user story onward, and I'm constantly building off of that, now I've already defined my unit test cases that are at that first level after commit within my CI/CD pipeline. So I've now enabled the ability to automate. We've heard that term a lot, and that's another one that feels like the holy grail that we never quite achieve. I can now automate those tests in a whole new way just by bringing that threat modeling information so early in the process.
Yeah, and that way it's not perceived as an interrupt. Again, it's a positive augmentation of their process. And, you talk about automation. That's thrown around a lot. And oftentimes the process involved in getting automation going, just getting a dev team aware that this automation is happening and, used to the cadence of maybe receiving the vulnerability reports and then remediating them. Getting there, again, it's a process, but once you get there, that trust of we're all aligned in the same goal is a lot easier to elucidate than, hey, here's a 400-page report. Good luck.
So, and that's a really good point, right? If I want developers to adopt my security initiatives, my security practices, and I say that as a security person, that's the my, right? I need to come meet them where they live. I need to be leveraging automation. How do you mentioned Jenkins before, how do I bring into that continuous integration environment these capabilities? And it's looking at how do I select tools that are going to fit into this automated pipeline? And so from a security perspective, this needs to be part of our focus. So as we're looking at this grand scheme of, all right, here's everything that's within a DevOps or DevSecOps pipeline, I need to make sure that those elements that I'm asking my developers to implement integrate with these technologies that they're using.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that's when you're looking for these tools, look for extensibility, look for the ability to, drive these tools using API calls rather than having to operate within a UI, even if it's some kind of, single pane of glass type pitch that we're all familiar with. As developers, you're used to, interacting in a much different manner. So things like, these Jenkins automation or integrations, it's all API driven. And so you can even roll your own automation if you're savvy. And then the feasibility of using those tools is still the same.
And you even see the ecosystems up here. So, thinking in terms of shortening these feedback cycles, looking for tools that instead of providing a report at all, what about having those tools integrated in the IDE where I'm typing and in real time, if I'm making a call to a vulnerable package, why can't I have a tool that tells me right there in my IDE, hey, you're pulling in something here that's got a vulnerability. Are you sure you really want to do this? And then give the developers that ability to react to that in real time. Now you're not saddling them with outside processes that create friction, that create these slow feedback loops that ultimately, at the end of the day, cause developers not to adopt the practices we want to do. So go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying, not to provide counterpoint here, but I just want to, bolster that with a healthy dose of, don't put all your eggs in one basket, and realize that these integrations and these tools still require some hand holding, for especially when you're kind of getting off your feet. You're going to need to work with dev teams. And again, I'm speaking to security folks because that's where I come from. You're going to need to work with the dev teams to understand maybe what these exploitable vulnerabilities are and how they manifest and what they look like, because something like a SAST tool is going to show you a very explicit, piece of the code and how we've signature matched that to a known vulnerable database. But something like a DAS tool is going to show you how that vulnerability is manifested in HTTP. So again, you may have to do some enablement for your dev teams to kind of get this going, and vice versa. For the dev teams, you may have to do some enablement on the security side. But I think the point is, with these tools, they really make that whole process, that whole cohesion process, a lot easier.
Exactly. And that feeds perfectly into the last point. I mentioned before Kelsey Hightower's tweet and how much I like the idea of the people. And I also mentioned this idea of meeting them where they live. When we're building a DevSecOps culture, that is a culture of shared responsibility, where everybody is responsible for every element of the pipeline. We've put it out there. There's plenty of noise being made about, security is everybody's responsibility. Well, what about dev? Isn't delivering code quick just as much a responsibility of the security practices
Absolutely.
as it is the dev practices?
Yep.
Isn't delivering stable infrastructure, that's on the developers and the security team as much as it is on anybody that has an ops discipline? And so what we need to start creating is this culture where we all understand that DevSec and ops are responsible for DevSec and ops, that shared responsibility. Sure, you've got people who are very specialized in development, and that's their key focus. You've got the security team who's very focused and has that niche knowledge, and you've got the ops folks. But how do we start to drive more of that mutual empathy? Not just the security team having empathy for developers, which is lacking for sure, but how do we also get developers to have that same level of empathy for the security team? So a couple ideas here. The first is doing a walk a mile in their shoes program, really tying the various disciplines together and bringing them into a mutual engagement where their daily activities are tied together. They're in the same meetings. They're going to the same stand-ups. And then we've already mentioned from a tools perspective, paving that road. Make it easy to get code from the backlog to production, but do it securely and stable.
Yeah, and some operational tips here, like it says up there. When you are selecting your security tools, involve your dev department. I mean, again, for some folks that's an obvious one, but you should definitely have their buy-in. You should at least help them understand, what these initiatives or approaches are going to do, how they're going to augment, or let's face it, change the development lifecycle, and what the results are going to be. Security folks, go to a dev stand-up. Just start attending those meetings. Maybe ask first, but show up and listen, and don't be a know-it-all. Don't try to be security person in the meeting, but just sit there and try to understand and get used to the nomenclature. And same thing for dev folks. Come and join our security stand-ups and try to understand maybe where we're coming from, and just a little bit of that. Bridges built from both sides. It helps out a ton.
Absolutely. So I know it's a short talk today, not a little 25-minute slot here, but definitely appreciate you all coming and joining us for this. Certainly open to continuing the conversation. Both of our contact information is up there. Easiest way to get in touch with me, you see my Twitter handle there. Please, by all means, feel free to jump in anytime and follow me on Twitter, shoot me a DM. I'm always happy to have these conversations.
All right. Well, thank you for that talk. We We do have a couple of questions. A couple of them are by me because I was sitting there taking notes like, yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
Security people talking about devs. Finally, yes, let's do this.
Right? I'm pumped. First question, do you have any recommendations on modern books about securing code?
Boy, that's a tough one. Actually, for modern books, I can't say that I specifically do. I know there's a number of them out there. I can think of a few publishers who do really good work in that area. Manning and Wiley are two that come right to mind, who are doing a lot of books right now focused on not just learning code, but learning code securely and so forth. I don't have a specific title though. I apologize.
Maybe not secure coding, because again, that's not the perspective I come from, but definitely DevSecOps, the Phoenix project, is a must read. It is awesome. It is about a fictional company, and if you read the book, you'll know what I'm talking about. But it's awesome. It really talks about the evolution of integrating security into development, kind of the trials and tribulations, lessons learned. Because again, that's the unfortunate side of it, is it's a change, and change is sometimes fraught with lessons learned.
Yep, absolutely. Do you feel like the tooling has gotten better, becoming more accessible? And I think the quintessential example the questioner gave was licensing costs prohibiting widespread usage and adoption, right? So it's like, we can secure this pipeline, but not this pipeline because we don't have the budget.
Yeah, so that's a really good point, right? There's two questions that you actually asked in there. One, I think the tooling is definitely becoming more accessible. There's also a lot of niche point products out there. And so figuring out, which ones fit best into your pipeline. What we're really seeing, though, that's really nice is there's a lot of different vendors out there now who have community editions that are available. Not to toot any horns, but I happen to work for one, right? We're seeing more and more of that. I think the other thing that we're going to start to see more of, and it's really become a focus, are these DevSecOps tools that really come at it from a developer perspective. Again, I can sit here and talk about Snyk all day long, of course, but this isn't a sales pitch. There are others too that we think about. A lot of those logos you saw up there that are in those pipelines, a lot of them are starting to address this now, not just from a security perspective, but from how do we create tools that developers actually want to use?
Yeah. And, working for a vendor that also produces open source software, Metasploit, right, for that. It's kind of both sides of the coin. I would say, to answer this question, we see the kind of operations side of security moving to more of an operations team, and maybe the security process enabled and creation moving to more of a concentrated InfoSec team, at least in these DevSecOps models where these tools can't be so security focused, kind of like we're talking about, meeting people in the middle and being just a little bit more usable across the board. So some folks would say they're becoming easier to use. I don't think so. I think they're becoming more streamlined because we're able to make maybe a little bit more assumptions with the configuration of things like, integrations or, app scans or something like that. But I will say that some vendors aren't thinking in the right way as far as how the products are licensed. But a good vendor will listen to their customer base and make changes to better suit their use cases.
Awesome. All right. We're out of time, but the next session's mine and the questions are mine. So I'm going to go ahead and ask it. Does product own part of the security posture, since they are typically prioritizing the backlog?
Garrett knows that I love this question because, yes, I am all about threat modeling. So I mentioned threat modeling in the backlog before. That I've actually in other talks used the term, and I hate myself for saying it, but I'm going to say it again, biz DevSecOps. I really don't want to get in the business of just continuing to grow that terminology, but really bringing business into this is crucial. Having the product team be a part of early on, they're the ones writing that user story. They're the ones that understand, okay, what is actually most important in this application? What are the critical assets, the critical functionality? and speak to that in terms of business impact. You think about threat modeling with like Stride and Dread and all these frameworks. They're great, but they're so technically focused, they lack context. And so, being able to bring that stronger context of this is what this threat means in terms of our business and in terms of this application, and making that a part of the user story. Now you can rely on well-trained and especially your senior developers and architects to say, all right, because of that, we have to have these controls.
Well, and you can draw a parallel to just regular security. I mean, you need to have different perspectives to really make it work.
Awesome. All right, well, we got to cut it there. Hey, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the presentation, and I know our audience did as well. So thanks again.
Yeah,
Thanks,
I appreciate it. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Bye-bye.